He never sat on the Iron Throne. He never wore a crown. And yet, for 20 years, Tywin Lannister was the most powerful man in Westeros. He was born to House Lannister at its lowest point, the son of a father so weak that powerful men openly mocked him. Tywin grew up watching his family's name become the joke of Westeros, and he made a decision early. No one would ever laugh at them again. Tywin did not inherit greatness. He built it through war, fear, and ruthless precision. He restored House Lannister, broke the families that stood against him, and turned his name into one that could silence rooms before he even entered them. Kings wore crowns, but Tywin held power. He governed the realm, shaped its wars, and imposed order on chaos through sheer force of will. But power built on fear always carries a cost. Tywin could command armies, outmaneuver rivals, and bend kingdoms to his will, but he could not shape his children in the same way he shaped kingdoms. And in the end, the legacy he devoted his life to securing would become the thing that turned against him. This is the story of Tywin Lannister, from the boy who watched his father fail, to the ruthless patriarch who built his house into a dynasty and set the stage for its destruction. To understand Tywin Lannister, you first have to understand what he inherited. What he inherited was the name. House Lannister is one of the oldest noble houses in Westeros. Their seat, Casterly Rock, sits above the Sunset Sea on the western coast. It is a fortress carved into a mountain, built above gold mines so vast that the Lannisters became the wealthiest family in the realm, almost by accident of geography. Their lineage stretches back thousands of years, to a legendary figure called Lann the Clever. According to the old stories, Lann the Clever was a trickster who swindled Casterly Rock from its original owners through cunning alone, without drawing a single blade. That detail matters. From the very beginning, the Lannister myth was not built on martial glory. It was built on intelligence, image, and the ability to make others believe the Lannisters were more formidable than any single sword could prove. For thousands of years, that myth held. When Aegon the Conqueror landed on Westeros with his dragons and began burning kingdoms into submission, the Lannisters did not fight him. They calculated. They bent the knee at the right moment, preserved their wealth, preserved their seat, and emerged from the conquest with their power essentially intact. Survival through intelligence, not defiance. Lann the Clever would have approved. By the time we reach the generation before Tywin, House Lannister carries all of this weight. Ancient name, unmatched wealth, a seat that projects dominance simply by existing. The foundation is extraordinary. And then there is Titus. Tywin's father is one of the more tragic figures in recent Westerosi history. It is not because he suffered greatly, but because he caused suffering simply by being who he was. He was a gentle man, a generous man. He was a man who wanted to be liked and could not understand why that wanting was itself a form of weakness. He loaned gold freely and rarely collected repayment. He forgave insults that should have been answered with steel. When lesser lords came to him with grievances, he resolved them with accommodation rather than authority. Those lords left his court understanding that the Lord of Casterly Rock could be managed. Word spread, the loans multiplied, the debts went uncollected, and quietly, in the halls of houses that owed the Lannisters fortunes they would never repay, men began to laugh. They called him the laughingstock of Casterly Rock. The damage was not only financial. A lord's authority rests on perception as much as force, and the perception of Titus Lannister was that he was soft. His vassals tested him constantly, and he failed those tests consistently. Among the most aggressive were two houses whose names would eventually become synonymous with Tywin's fury: House Rain of Castamere and House Tarbeck of Tarbeck Hall. Both had borrowed heavily from Tytos and understood that he lacked the will to demand repayment. Both were already positioning themselves as powers in their own right. They stood not under the Lannisters so much as alongside them. After Titus's wife, Jane Marbrand, died, the situation worsened. Jane had been a steadying presence. She was a woman of genuine character, who provided what Titus could not provide himself. Without her, Titus drifted further. He took a mistress, a low-born woman with no political standing, and elevated her to a position no one in Casterly Rock could ignore. She wore the jewels of his dead wife and gave instructions to Lannister servants. She sat at his table, accepting the courtesies owed to a lady of the house. And Tytos allowed it, openly, without apparent awareness of what it communicated to every lord watching. This is the world Tywin Lannister grew up inside. It was a world of inherited greatness being slowly, publicly dismantled by a man too kind or too frightened to defend it. The lesson Tywin drew from his father was not complicated. He saw what happened when a lord prioritized being liked over being respected. He watched the Lannister name, thousands of years in the making, become a source of quiet amusement in the very halls it should have commanded. And he decided, with the particular cold clarity that would define everything he ever did, that he would spend his life ensuring it never happened again. That decision is where Tywin Lannister truly begins, not at his birth or his inheritance, but in the long, humiliating years of watching his father fail and choosing to become the opposite of everything he saw. Tywin Lannister was born around 242 years after Aegon's conquest, the eldest son of Titus and Jane Lannister. From the beginning, he was serious in the way that some children are serious. Not sullen, not cold, but watchful, precise. He was the kind of boy who observed everything and concluded things quietly, without announcing what he had decided. He had every material comfort a child in Westeros could want. What he lacked was a father he could respect. Every debt left uncollected, every insult laughed off, every vassal who left Casterly Rock having extracted another concession he hadn't earned. Tywin watched all of it and filed it away. The portrait of weakness accumulating in his mind became the template he would spend his entire life working against. Then came the moment that fixed everything in Tywin's understanding. Around the time he was 12 or 13, Tywin accompanied his father to King's Landing, where Tytos had occasion to serve at court. This was Tywin's first real exposure to the broader world of power. It was his introduction to the Red Keep, to the Iron Throne, and to lords from across the Seven Kingdoms conducting the business of the realm. It was also his first opportunity to see how other men perceived his father outside the Westerlands. What he found was that the perception was the same. Tytos was treated with a particular kind of courteous pity. He was acknowledged as the Lord of Casterly Rock and shown the formal respect his title demanded. But he was privately regarded as something less than his position warranted. The laughter had travelled. The reputation had preceded him. For a boy of Tywin's temperament, this was not merely embarrassing. It was clarifying. The problem was not localized to Casterly Rock. It was not a regional failure that could be managed quietly once he inherited. The Lannister name itself had been devalued across the entire realm. Whatever he eventually built would have to be built on top of that damage, and it would have to be built decisively enough to erase the memory of his father's tenure entirely. At court, Tywin also encountered figures who would shape his understanding of what power actually looked like when competently exercised. He observed lords who commanded rooms without raising their voices. He watched men who had cultivated genuine fear in others and understood how that fear functioned as a currency. He was learning in real time the difference between a lord who was tolerated and a lord who was obeyed. He also formed early friendships that would define his adult life. Among the young men at court was Aerys Targaryen. He was the king's heir, charismatic and volatile, given to enthusiasms that arrived intensely and faded quickly, and Steffon Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, dependable and direct. These three, Tywin, Aerys, and Steffon, became close in the way that young men with power and proximity become close. They were well matched in different ways. The friendship felt genuine. It would not survive the decades ahead intact. Back at Casterly Rock, the situation with Tywin's mother was already deteriorating. Jane Mar-Bran was the one figure in the household who carried genuine authority. Not the formal authority of a lord, but the quieter authority of a woman of strong character. She understood what the family needed and provided it without announcement. She was Tywin's anchor in those years, the one presence that suggested the household was not entirely adrift. When she died, the last structural support holding Titus's weaknesses in check was gone. The mistress arrived, the jewels were distributed, and the servants took their instructions from a woman with no standing to give them. And Titus, apparently incapable of understanding what message this sent to the watching world, allowed it to continue. Tywin was still a young man when all of this unfolded, but he was no longer a child in any meaningful sense. He had already reached the conclusion that would govern everything he did from that point forward. That conclusion was that sentiment was the mechanism of failure. He concluded that love freely displayed was weakness waiting to be exploited. And he concluded that the only protection a lord had against the contempt of others was the absolute certainty that his anger had consequences. This was not cruelty for its own sake. Tywin never took pleasure in suffering the way that genuinely cruel men do. It was colder than cruelty. It was a system, a philosophy built from observation and loss, and the specific humiliation of watching greatness, squandered by a man who wanted, above all else, to be liked. The boy who emerged from those years was already, in all essential respects, the man who would make the realm tremble. He simply needed the opportunity to demonstrate it. That opportunity was coming, and when it arrived, he would not waste it the way his father had wasted everything else. Tywin arrived at court as a young man already formed. The years of watching his father had done their work. He did not need King's Landing to teach him what power was. He needed it to show him how power operated at scale, across the full width of the realm, in the hands of men who had been practicing it for decades. What he found was a court defined by its king. Aegon V, called Aegon the Unlikely, was one of the more idealistic Targaryens to sit the Iron Throne. He was called Aegon the Unlikely because he was the fourth son of a fourth son and never expected to rule. He had spent his youth travelling Westeros as a common boy, before his succession was ever imaginable. Those years had given him a genuine regard for the small folk that most highborn lords never developed, and many actively disdained. Aegon believed that the purpose of a king was to serve the realm, not merely the lords who administered it, but the ordinary people who lived under them. He pursued reforms that unsettled the nobility. He was not a weak man, but he was a principled one. And principle has a particular kind of friction when it meets the realities of feudal power. Tywin observed all of this with the detachment of someone cataloguing errors. Aegon's idealism was, in Tywin's framework, a form of sentimentality. It was the same impulse that had made his father forgive debts and absorb insults. The scale was grander, the intentions more elevated, but the structural flaw was identical. A ruler who prioritized how things ought to be over how things actually were would always be outmaneuvered by men willing to operate in reality. This was not a lesson Tywin announced. He simply filed it away, alongside everything else. At court, Tywin continued developing the relationships that had begun in his earlier visits. His friendship with the young Prince Aerys deepened during these years. Examining it carefully matters because it was, for a time, genuinely close. Understanding why it eventually fractured requires understanding what it was built on. Aerys Targaryen was everything Tywin was not, in the most surface sense. Tywin was controlled where Aerys was expressive, patient where Aerys was impulsive. Where Tywin commanded respect through stillness and precision, Aerys drew people in through magnetism and unpredictability. He was entertaining in the way that volatile, intelligent people are entertaining. You never quite knew what he would say next, and that uncertainty was its own kind of charm. Together, they were complementary in a way that felt, from the outside, like a natural partnership. Aerys supplied the warmth and the spectacle. Tywin supplied the substance and the strategy. People who observed them in these early years understood that Aerys was the face and Tywin was the architecture behind it. For a time, both men seemed comfortable with this arrangement. What neither of them fully acknowledged was how differently they understood its terms. It was also during these years at court that Tywin's connection to Joanna Lannister solidified into something more than kinship. Joanna was his cousin. She was a woman whose character stands in almost complete contrast to the public image Tywin projected. Where he was armored, she was open. Where he presented the world with cold authority, she possessed a gentleness that seemed to operate without calculation. She was intelligent, politically aware, and entirely unintimidated by Tywin in the way that most people were intimidated by him. This mattered enormously. Tywin was not a man who allowed access. His entire method of operating in the world was built on the principle that distance was protection. The less others knew of what he felt, the less leverage they had over him. Joanna was the exception to this, the one person in his life with whom the distance collapsed without strategic cost. She also served in private as genuine counsel. Tywin listened to her, not performatively, not as a concession, but because her judgment was sound and he knew it. In a life constructed almost entirely of managed relationships, his relationship with Joanna was the one place where something unmanaged operated. There was already, during these court years, an undercurrent of tension connected to Joanna. Aerys, charming, entitled, and increasingly given to the assumption that his status permitted him liberties that it did not, made remarks about Joanna that overstepped. At the wedding of Tywin and Joanna, Aerys's behavior was noted by those present as inappropriate in ways that Tywin could not have missed. The precise nature of what occurred is lost to the discretion of those who recorded it. But the friction it created between the two men was real, and it never fully resolved. It was simply absorbed into the architecture of their relationship and left there, unaddressed, gathering weight. Tywin and Joanna married. It was a union that combined political logic with genuine feeling. This was rare in a world where marriage was primarily an instrument of alliance. They were well matched. She humanized him in the only domain where he permitted humanization. And then Titus died. Tywin inherited Casterly Rock in his early 20s. His very first acts as Lord announced, with absolute clarity, what kind of man now held the seat. He sent word to every house that owed his father gold. The debts would be repaid, in full, immediately. No extensions, no renegotiation, no accommodation. The era of Lannister patience with unpaid obligations was finished. He had his father's mistress stripped of the jewels she had been given. These were the jewels that had belonged to Tywin's mother. She was made to walk through the streets of Lannisport in public humiliation, confessing her crimes to anyone who witnessed her passage. Every piece of jewelry was catalogued and returned. Every order she had given to Lannister servants was noted and reversed. These were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of signal. Tywin was not punishing a woman of low birth for ambition. He was demonstrating to every lord in the Westerlands and every court in Westeros that was paying attention that the nature of Lannister authority had fundamentally changed. The message was not complicated. What his father had permitted, he would not permit. What his father had overlooked, he would not overlook. The Lannister name meant something different now. The message was received. Lords who had borrowed and delayed repayment suddenly found gold they had not been able to locate during Titus's tenure. Bannermen who had grown accustomed to casual familiarity adjusted their manner. The quiet laughter that had followed the Lannister name through the halls of a dozen castles did not disappear overnight, but it began to fade, replaced by something more cautious, more watchful. Tywin was not yet feared in the way he would eventually be feared. He had not yet done anything that required fear, precisely. But the shape of what was coming was already visible to anyone paying attention. Two houses were paying very close attention. The Reynes and the Tarbecks had built their positions on the assumption that Lannister weakness was a permanent condition. They understood that the assumption no longer held. The question now was what they intended to do about it. They would answer that question shortly, and Tywin's answer to their answer would define the next 800 years of Westerosi political culture. The Reynes and the Tarbecks did not rebel because they were foolish. That is the first thing to understand. They rebelled because they had performed a rational calculation based on decades of accurate observation. They had simply failed to account for the one variable that had changed. For years, under Titus, their strategy had been correct. Test the Lord, find his limits, expand into the space his weakness creates. House Reyne had executed this approach with particular sophistication. Roger Reyne, the Red Lion, as he was known, was a man of genuine military capability and considerable personal magnetism. He had built Castamere into something approaching an independent power base. His wealth rivaled the Lannisters' own. His military reputation exceeded anything the Westerlands could otherwise produce. He had loaned money to Titus, reversing the natural order of vassal and lord. The Lannisters were, in a meaningful sense, indebted to their own bannerman. Lady Elyn Tarbeck had operated similarly, if with different methods. She was a political creature of the First Order, shrewd, ambitious, and entirely comfortable, using Titus's accommodating nature as a tool. House Tarbeck was not as powerful as House Reyne, but the two families were connected through marriage and through a shared understanding that the Lannister weakness they had exploited together was best defended together. When Tywin inherited and began his immediate reassertion of authority, both houses faced the same choice. They could submit to the new order and relinquish the positions they had spent years constructing, or they could resist and gamble that the young new lord was performing strength rather than possessing it. They chose to resist, and in choosing to resist, they chose their own extinction. The opening moves were Tarbeck, when Tywin sent men to Tarbeck Hall to begin the process of debt collection and re-establish the formal relationship between lord and vassal. Lady Ellyn did not simply refuse. She took the Lannister envoys hostage. This was a direct, unambiguous challenge that announced, to anyone watching, that House Tarbeck intended to treat the new Lord of Casterly Rock the way they had treated the old one. It was a catastrophic misreading of the man they were dealing with. Tywin's response arrived before the shock of the initial provocation had fully settled. He sent back one of the Tarbeck hostages he held in return, in 3 pieces, 1 piece for each Lannister being held at Tarbeck Hall. The message required no interpretation. This was Tywin Lannister establishing, with complete finality, that the rules of engagement had changed. Not negotiation, not the measured response of a lord seeking resolution, but a declaration that anyone who had not yet understood this would understand it now. The Tarbecks released the Lannister hostages, but the lines were drawn. Lady Ellyn and Roger Rayne understood that accommodation was no longer available to them. They understood that Tywin would not be satisfied with submission alone after what had already occurred. And so the rebellion that had been implicit in their positioning for years became explicit. They raised their banners. They prepared for war. They were not without resources. House Rayne commanded one of the most capable military forces in the Westerlands. Castamere was a formidable seat, built into the hills, with deep mines running beneath it that could shelter defenders and supply them for extended periods. Roger Rayne was a skilled battlefield commander, the kind of man whose reputation alone could attract additional support. If the Raynes and Tarbecks had been fighting Tytos, the outcome might genuinely have been uncertain. They were not fighting Tytos. Tywin moved with a speed and decisiveness that gave his enemies no time to consolidate. He did not wait for the rebellion to develop its full shape. He did not allow the Raynes and Tarbecks time to reach out to other dissatisfied houses. He did not permit them the luxury of choosing the ground on which they would fight. He assembled his forces and marched immediately, with the particular controlled urgency of a man who understood that delay was itself a form of concession. Tarbeck Hall fell first. The siege was brief. House Tarbeck's military strength was never the equal of House Rayne's, and without Rayne support arriving in time to reinforce them, the castle could not hold. Lady Ellyn Tarbeck and her family died in the fighting, some accounts suggesting the tower collapsed upon them during the assault. House Tarbeck was not defeated. It was ended. The castle was slighted, its walls torn down, its towers demolished, its ability to serve as a future seat of resistance permanently removed. The Tarbeck line was extinguished. There would be no Tarbeck restoration. There would be no next generation quietly rebuilding, waiting for a better moment. Tywin had not simply won a battle. He had solved the problem completely. Roger Rayne, understanding now the full nature of what he was facing, retreated to Castamere. This was a defensible choice. Castamere was genuinely difficult to assault, with the mines beneath it providing shelter and the hills around it limiting the approaches an attacker could use. A conventional siege might last months, even years. Rayne had supplies, men, and defensible ground. He calculated that Tywin, having made his point with the Tarbecks, might be willing to negotiate terms rather than commit to a prolonged and costly reduction of Castamere. This was his second miscalculation, and his last. Tywin did not assault Castamere. He did not set up a conventional siege. He did not send envoys offering terms of surrender. He looked at the castle built into the hills with its deep mines running beneath it, thought about the men sheltering in those mines believing they were protected, and found a solution that was characteristically total. He flooded them. His engineers diverted water into the mine shafts. The tunnels that the rains had retreated into, believing them a place of safety, became their tomb. Every man, woman, and child of House Rain drowned in the darkness beneath Castamere. Not in battle, not with swords in their hands, but in cold water in the tunnels they had trusted to protect them. When it was over, House Rain was gone. Not defeated, not subordinated, not stripped of titles and left to rebuild in reduced circumstances. Gone. The name, the line, the castle, all of it erased with the methodical completeness of a man who had decided that partial solutions were no solutions at all. The logic Tywin applied here runs through everything he ever did. A defeated enemy can recover. A humiliated lord can nurse his grievance, rebuild his strength across a generation, and eventually present the same problem again in a different form. The Rains had been given years of Tytos's weakness to exploit, and they had used every one of those years effectively. If even one reign of fighting age survived Castamere, that person carried with them the memory, the motivation, and potentially the capability to reconstitute the problem at a later date. Tywin did not solve problems in ways that created future problems. He solved them completely, or not at all. He was 19 years old. He had just exterminated one of the most powerful families in the Westerlands and destroyed another. He had done so efficiently and so totally that the campaign barely registered as a prolonged conflict. It was over before most of the realm had fully processed that it had begun. In the courts of Westeros, singers did what singers do with events of sufficient magnitude. They turned it into a song. The song that emerged was called The Rains of Castamere. It described in spare and mournful language what had become of a great house that chose the wrong enemy. "Who are you?" it asked. "Who comes to bear a golden cloak?" And the answer the song provided was the silence of empty halls and water in the dark. Tywin did not commission this song. He did not need to. It arose because what he had done was so absolute, so beyond the scale of conventional political violence, that it demanded to be memorialized. The song was not propaganda. It was testimony. And because it was testimony rather than propaganda, it carried a weight that no commissioned tribute could have achieved. Every lord in Westeros who heard it understood its meaning. Not just that the Rains were gone. That was merely an event. The meaning ran deeper than that. House Lannister, under this lord, operated without the limitations that other lords accepted as natural constraints. The line between victory and annihilation, which most powerful men maintained out of convention and political calculation, did not exist for Tywin Lannister. That understanding was not a boast. It was not performed. It was simply true, and truth has a kind of authority that performance can never achieve. The Westerlands consolidated immediately. The remaining vassal houses, whatever private ambitions they had been nurturing under Tytos, set those ambitions aside with remarkable speed. There were no further open challenges to Lannister authority during Tywin's lifetime. Not one. In a feudal world where powerful lords were constantly testing each other's limits, the complete absence of challenge is itself a measurement of how thoroughly Castamere had done its work. Tywin returned to Casterly Rock, having answered definitively the question that his father's entire reign had left open, the question of whether the Lannister name meant anything, whether the lion had teeth. It did. And now everyone knew it. He was not yet 30 years old. He had not yet become Hand of the King. He had not yet navigated the disasters and triumphs that the decades ahead would bring. But in every essential respect, the man who would shape the next half-century of Westerosi history was already fully formed. He stood above empty mines, in the silence where a great house used to be, having just demonstrated that he was the most dangerous lord in the realm. The Iron Throne had noticed, and it wanted him. The bodies settled, the water drained, and the silence at Castamere became permanent. And then the song began to spread. Most powerful men in Westeros cultivated their reputations deliberately. They commissioned songs, sponsored tournaments, arranged flattering records. Tywin did none of this. He did not need to. The reigns of Castamere emerged because what happened at Castamere exceeded the normal vocabulary of political violence. It demanded to be remembered, and so it was. It was absorbed into a general understanding of what Lannister power actually meant. When someone played the song, everyone in the room understood the message. Not just that the reins were gone, but that House Lannister operated without the limitations other lords accepted as natural constraints. This is where Tywin's genius operated most subtly. Reputation functions as a force multiplier in a way that armies cannot. An army requires feeding, mobilizing, marching. Reputation is always present, operating in every room where the Lannister name is spoken, preventing conflicts that would otherwise require armies to resolve. After Castamere, Tywin rarely needed to demonstrate his capacity for total violence again. The silence of potential challengers was the song's second verse, unwritten but universally understood. The cost of this philosophy was isolation. Tywin had no true peers. He had no lords he regarded as equals, no relationships of mutual respect outside the formal hierarchy. He had subordinates and superiors, and the texture of human connection between those categories was largely absent. Most rulers wanted their subjects to feel affection alongside obligation. Tywin wanted only the second. Affection was unreliable. Fear was consistent. It did not shift with political winds. Steffan Baratheon remained one of the few exceptions, a genuine friendship from court. When Steffan drowned returning from a mission to Essos that Aerys had sent him on, Tywin received the news with his characteristic composure. The loss removed one of the last connections in his life that operated outside pure calculation. Joanna remained. In private, with her, the architecture of distance and control relaxed. She had opinions he listened to, not as a concession, but because her judgment had earned his genuine regard. She was the only person who could access the man beneath the Lord. And then came the evening in 273 years after Aegon's conquest, when Joanna went into labor with their third child and did not survive it. The child was small, malformed, a dwarf. He was Tyrion. Tywin could not separate the child from the death. Grief redirected is still grief, but it expressed itself as contempt, and contempt hardened into something structural that would not change, regardless of what Tyrion did or did not do to deserve it. This is where the cultural weight of the reigns of Castamere begins to acquire its irony. The song was a warning about the consequences of underestimating Tywin Lannister. But in the very years when it was spreading across Westeros, Tywin was making his own miscalculation. It was one he would never correct, one that would eventually return to him with a crossbow bolt on a privy. He was building his reputation on the understanding that weakness was always punished. He was failing to understand that his treatment of Tyrion was its own form of weakness. The Iron Throne had noticed what he had built. Aerys Targaryen, now king, had an offer to make. It was the most powerful position available to a man who was not king. Tywin accepted. Tywin Lannister arrived in King's Landing as Hand of the King around 262 years after Aegon's conquest. For a long time, nearly 2 decades, the arrangement worked. This is important to establish clearly. The story of Tywin and Aerys is so defined by its catastrophic ending that the years of genuine function tend to disappear beneath the wreckage. The partnership was not always a disaster. In its early form, it was the most effective governing arrangement the Seven Kingdoms had seen in generations. Aerys provided the throne, the legitimacy, the spectacle of kingship. Tywin provided everything else. The realm prospered. Taxes were collected efficiently and spent with discipline. Disputes between lords were resolved with a consistency that the realm had not always enjoyed. The crown's finances, which had drifted under previous administrations, were brought into order. Trade expanded. Roads were maintained. The great machinery of governance, which requires constant attention and a particular kind of patient administrative intelligence to keep functioning, hummed with unusual reliability. Small folk and lords alike, when they spoke of this period with approval, attributed its successes to the hand rather than the king. This was accurate, and it was also the seed of everything that followed. Aerys knew it was accurate, and knowing it was accurate, he began to resent it. The dynamic between them is worth mapping carefully, because it deteriorated in stages rather than all at once, and each stage had its own logic. In the early years, Aerys was content, or something close to content. He was king. He had the ceremonies, the throne room, the deference of the court, and the pleasures of his position. Tywin ran the administration and Aerys performed the monarchy, and neither man initially found this division intolerable. They had, after all, been friends. The familiarity of that friendship provided a cushion against the friction that the arrangement inevitably generated. But Aerys was not a stable man. He had never been stable. The volatility that had made him entertaining at court as a young prince had always contained a darker current. It was an impulsiveness that could turn from charm to cruelty without clear warning. As king, without the social constraints that had operated on him as a prince, that volatility found more room to express itself. His enthusiasms became more extreme. His suspicions deepened. The paranoia that would eventually consume him entirely began, in these middle years, as something more manageable. It was a tendency to see slights where none were intended, to interpret political maneuvering as personal betrayal, and to read the loyalty of those around him through a lens that was slowly, consistently distorting. Tywin watched this progression with the cool assessment of a man cataloguing a problem. He managed it through the same methods he managed everything: patience, control, the careful application of authority where Aerys was not paying attention, and strategic withdrawal where he was. He understood that Aerys needed to believe himself the primary power in the relationship, and provided that belief, at least superficially, while continuing to run the realm as he saw fit. For years, this worked. And then Joanna died, and Tyrion arrived, and Tywin's private architecture shifted in ways he did not display, but that affected everything. The loss of the one person who had balanced him left him more rigid, more sealed, more entirely the public Tywin without remainder. He continued as hand. He continued to govern effectively, but the cushion was gone. Meanwhile, Aerys was getting worse. The specific event that broke whatever remained of the functional partnership was the defiance of Duskendale. In 277 years after Aegon's conquest, Lord Dennis Darklyn of Duskendale took a step so audacious it seemed almost incomprehensible. He refused a royal summons and fortified his town. When Aerys came personally to demand submission, Darklyn captured him. The king of the Seven Kingdoms was held hostage in Duskendale for nearly half a year. Tywin's response was to blockade the town and wait. This was the correct strategic decision. Storming Duskendale risked the king's life. A prolonged blockade would eventually force Darklyn to negotiate or starve. The logic was sound, and the patience was characteristic. The outcome was ultimately resolved when Sir Barristan Selmy, young, brilliant, and arguably the finest knight of his generation, slipped into the town alone and extracted Aerys. He did so before Tywin's patience had fully run its course. Aerys survived. He returned to King's Landing diminished and transformed. The months of captivity had done something to whatever stability he had possessed. The paranoia, already present, metastasized into something clinical. He had been helpless, humiliated, held by a minor lord, while his great hand sat outside the walls and did not act. The fact that acting would have killed him was a logic Aerys could no longer reliably process. What he processed instead was the simpler, darker reading, that Tywin had waited because Tywin had wanted him to die, that the hand had seen an opportunity to let the king's problem resolve itself, that he had chosen patience over rescue because a dead Aerys was useful to a hand who wanted, in Aerys's increasingly fractured understanding, to be king himself. This suspicion, once formed, could not be dislodged. Aerys had always known that Tywin was the more capable man. He had always lived in the particular shadow that a brilliant subordinate casts over an adequate superior. After Duskendale, that knowledge curdled completely into conviction. Tywin was loyal, perhaps, but loyalty was itself suspicious. What did Tywin want? What was he building? The Westerlands were his, the Hand's Chain was his, the respect of the realm was his. What came next? The answer Aerys arrived at, in the deteriorating corridors of his own mind, was the Iron Throne, and that answer changed everything. He began to move against Tywin in the specific surgical way that only a king could move against a hand, not through open confrontation, which would have required acknowledging how dependent the realm was on Tywin's competence, but through the careful removal of the things that mattered most to him. The first cut was Cersei. Tywin had proposed a match between his daughter and Prince Rhaegar, the heir to the throne, already being spoken of as one of the most gifted young men in the realm. It was a natural proposal, politically elegant, and it would have bound the Lannister and Targaryen dynasties together in the most direct possible way. Tywin wanted it. Everyone who understood the politics of the realm could see why he wanted it. Aerys refused, not with diplomatic regret, not with alternative proposals designed to soften the rejection, but with contempt. He remarked that he would not have his son marry the daughter of his servant. The insult was deliberate and public and precisely calibrated to land where it would hurt most. Tywin's legacy, his house's future, his daughter's position, all dismissed with a single word: servant. Then came Jaime. In one of the more nakedly political acts of his reign, Aerys named Jaime Lannister to the Kingsguard. Jaime was 15, already showing the exceptional martial gifts that would make him legendary. He was Tywin's heir, the son through whom everything Tywin had built would pass to the next generation. The Kingsguard vow was absolute: no marriage, no inheritance, no lands, no titles. A Kingsguard knight belonged to the king until death. By placing Jaime in the Kingsguard, Aerys achieved several things simultaneously. He acquired one of the most talented young fighters in the realm for his personal protection. He demonstrated his authority over even the most powerful lord in Westeros, that he could reach into Tywin's family and take what he wanted. And he struck at the one vulnerability that Tywin, for all his armor, could not fully protect: his legacy. Without Jaime as heir, Casterly Rock would eventually pass to Tyrion, and Tywin would sooner burn Casterly Rock than see it pass to Tyrion. It was the cruelest thing Aerys ever did to him. It was also the most effective. Tywin resigned as Hand of the King. He did not rage or threaten or attempt to negotiate. He simply removed himself from the position, returned to Casterly Rock, and left Aerys to discover what governing the realm without him actually looked like. What it looked like was a succession of increasingly inadequate hands struggling to manage a king who was moving well beyond the boundaries of rational governance. Aerys's madness was no longer a tendency to be managed. It was the defining feature of his reign. He burned men alive with wildfire for offenses real and imagined, and summoned and dismissed advisors on whims. He developed a particular terrible affection for fire as both punishment and solution. He saw in its consuming totality something that satisfied the part of him that could no longer tolerate the complexity of the world. Tywin watched from Casterly Rock. He said very little. He managed the Westerlands with his characteristic efficiency, collected his taxes, administered his justice, and waited. He waited with the patience of a man who understood that the situation in King's Landing was going to resolve itself eventually, one way or another. The court that had once functioned under his oversight deteriorated steadily. The realm that had prospered under his administration began to fray at the edges, and the king who had called him a servant sat on his throne surrounded by fire and suspicion and the wreckage of a mind that had once been merely volatile and was now genuinely dangerous. Tywin had built the realm. Aerys was taking it apart. And somewhere in the calculation that Tywin ran continuously and quietly from his seat above the gold mines of the Westerlands, the numbers were already being rearranged for what came next. He did not know yet what form it would take, and he did not need to. He simply needed to be ready, and readiness for Tywin Lannister was never a problem. Damage without announcement accumulates in the space between what a child needs and what a parent provides. It accumulates until the gap becomes structural, load-bearing in its absence, defining the shape of everything built on top of it. Tywin Lannister did not beat his children. He did not neglect them in the material sense. He fed them, educated them, and positioned them within one of the most powerful households in the world. He held them to standards that, if met, would have produced extraordinary human beings. By the measures he recognized as valid, he was not a bad father. By the measures that actually matter, he failed all three of them completely. And that failure is not a footnote to his story. It is the story. Because the collapse of everything Tywin built did not come from outside. It came from within, from the three people closest to him, shaped by his hand, damaged by his method, and ultimately turned, in their different ways, against the edifice he had spent his life constructing. To understand how this happened, you have to look at each of them separately. Because Tywin's failure with each child was distinct, tailored almost to the specific nature of the person he was failing. Cersei came first, twin to Jaime by a matter of minutes. From her earliest years, she demonstrated qualities that Tywin could not help but recognize. She was intelligent in the way he was intelligent, not bookish, not academic, but politically. She read rooms and understood power dynamics before she had language to describe them. She watched her father operate and absorbed the lessons with a completeness that none of his other children matched. Tywin saw this. He acknowledged it in his way, in the attention he paid to her development and the conversations he permitted himself with her that he did not have with his other children. There was the implicit recognition that she understood things her brothers did not. There was something in their relationship that functioned, at least in its early form, as genuine connection. And then he arranged to marry her to Robert Baratheon. This was, from a purely political standpoint, one of his masterworks. Robert was king. Cersei as queen bound the Lannisters to the throne at the highest possible level, converting the wealth and power of Casterly Rock into royal adjacency. It ensured that whatever influence Tywin exercised in the realm would operate from the most central possible position. The logic was unimpeachable. What the logic did not account for was what it meant to give an intelligent, ambitious, politically capable woman to a man who would never see her as anything other than a decorative obligation. Robert did not want Cersei. He wanted Lyanna Stark, and Lyanna was dead. Cersei would spend her entire marriage being the wrong woman in the wrong place, politically powerful by title and personally powerless in every other respect. Tywin understood this on some level. He did not care. Cersei's feelings about the marriage were not a variable his system recognized as significant. She was an asset to be deployed. The deployment was optimal. The analysis was complete. What he failed to account for was the consequence of taking the most dangerous mind he had produced and sealing it inside a structure that gave it no legitimate outlet. Cersei could not rule, fight, or inherit. She could not be hand or lord or general. She could be queen consort, which meant she could be present at the center of power without ever holding it. She was close enough to understand everything and too constrained to act on any of it through legitimate means. So she acted through illegitimate means. The relationship with Jaime, her twin, the person who had shared her earliest existence, was the first and most consequential of these. It was the response of a person who had been denied every legitimate form of self-determination and found the one connection that existed entirely outside her father's control. Tywin suspected. The evidence suggests he knew, or knew enough, and chose not to investigate fully. Investigation would require action, and action against Cersei and Jaime would destabilize the very alliance he had built through her marriage. So he maintained deliberate blindness, which was its own form of control. He kept the information as a potential instrument without deploying it. It was always there, always poisoning the relationship beneath the surface, never resolved. The result was a daughter who had internalized her father's entire philosophy of power. His ruthlessness, his conviction that sentiment was weakness, his belief that strength was the only currency that mattered. But she had not inherited his patience or his strategic discipline. Cersei was Tywin without the parts that made Tywin functional. She had the ruthlessness without the restraint, the ambition without the precision. She was, in the most painful sense, what Tywin had made her, and what he had made her was dangerous in a direction he had not intended. Jaime was the one Tywin had planned everything around. From early childhood, Jaime presented the external qualities that Tywin's philosophy valued most completely. He was physically extraordinary, tall, golden, and graceful, in the way that genuine athletic talent produces. He was the kind of young man who commanded attention simply by entering a room. He was charming in the unforced way that some people are charming, without the calculation that charm usually requires. His gift with a sword bordered on the supernatural. In a world where martial reputation still mattered enormously, this made him immediately legible as someone significant. Tywin looked at Jaime and saw the Lannister image made flesh. Here was what the name should produce. Here was the heir who would carry everything forward. What Tywin missed, consistently and willfully, was what existed beneath the surface. Jaime was not, in his essential nature, the person his appearance suggested. He was more thoughtful than he seemed, and more emotionally perceptive than the Golden Knight persona allowed. He was fundamentally a person who wanted his actual character recognized and valued, rather than the image his appearance projected. He wanted to be seen. Tywin never saw him. He saw the image, cultivated it, and deployed it. When Aerys took it away by putting Jaime in the Kingsguard, Tywin responded with a fury that was entirely about legacy and entirely missing the point. It was not anger that Jaime had been harmed, but anger that an asset had been removed from his portfolio. Jaime understood this, perhaps not consciously, not with full articulation, but he understood it in the way that children always understand, beneath the level of language, whether they are being loved or managed. The silence Tywin maintained about what Jaime had actually done when he killed Aerys, and why the Kingslayer reputation was allowed to stand unchallenged, would become the defining wound in their relationship. That story belongs to the next section. Tyrion is where every thread in Tywin's story eventually arrives. He is the consequence of everything, the accumulated product of Tywin's philosophy, applied to a person that the philosophy had no framework for and no interest in developing one. He was born wrong, by Tywin's measure, in every direction simultaneously. Small when Lannisters were supposed to be golden and imposing, deformed when the image required perfection, and he had killed Joanna in being born, which meant Tywin could never look at him without the presence of an absence. The rejection was decided at birth and never revisited. The Shay situation, Tyrion's defiance of Tywin's prohibition on common women, was the visible surface of something much deeper. Tywin filed it away. He always used everything eventually. What he never examined was what he was building in the space between Tyrion's need and his refusal to meet it. He had made them weapons. He had never considered that weapons, given sufficient cause, turn around. Tywin's parenting was not separate from his politics. It was an extension of them. The same framework he applied to vassals and enemies and kings, he applied to his children with the same consistency and the same blindness to what it cost. Each child responded differently and produced a different variety of damage. But the damage in all three cases was structural. It was invisible while Tywin was present to hold everything together, and catastrophically apparent the moment he was not. Cersei's formation began early and never really stopped. She was, from childhood, the most politically alert of the three. She was the one who noticed the dynamics in a room before anyone had explained them to her. She understood instinctively that power was the organizing principle of the world she lived in, and that everything else was arrangement around that central fact. She watched her father the way Tywin had once watched Tytos, as a model, a template, an instruction manual for how to operate. But where Tywin had watched his father and learned what not to do, Cersei watched Tywin and learned what to do. She absorbed his principles with the completeness of someone who found in them the only framework that made sense of the world she was living in. Strength is the only protection. Fear is more reliable than love. Weakness invites destruction. Image must be defended absolutely. These lessons went into Cersei early and deep, and she carried them without questioning them for the rest of her life. What she could not absorb, because Tywin never demonstrated it, was the discipline that made those principles functional rather than catastrophic. Tywin's ruthlessness was always in service of a longer strategy. He could accept short-term humiliation for long-term gain, hold his anger until the moment was right, and perform patience he did not feel. He understood that the timing of power is as important as power itself. Cersei had none of this. The ruthlessness was there, fully formed. The patience was not. She was Tywin's philosophy without Tywin's restraint. That combination was not a lesser version of his strength. It was a different thing entirely, a dangerous thing, pointed in unpredictable directions, as likely to wound allies as enemies. The marriage to Robert was, in her experience of it, a decades-long demonstration of her father's fundamental indifference to who she was as a person. Tywin had constructed the match with complete political logic and zero consideration of what it meant for Cersei to spend her life beside a man who drank himself insensible. She was the richest woman in the realm, queen of the Seven Kingdoms, and utterly powerless in every domain that actually affected her daily existence. She built a parallel structure, informal power through information, through managing what Robert knew and did not know. The Jaime relationship was the center of it, the one domain entirely outside her father's reach and outside the arrangement he had made for her. It was the response of a person who had been denied every legitimate form of self-determination and found the one connection her father could not control. Cersei's choices were not simply personal failures. They were the logical consequence of a system that gave an intelligent, ambitious woman exactly two options: submit entirely, or find the spaces where the arrangements did not reach. Tywin created the system. The system produced the choices, and the choices eventually produced Joffrey. Jaime's formation was built on a different kind of damage, the damage of being valued for the wrong things so consistently that the right things atrophied. What Tywin valued in Jaime was the surface, the physical excellence, the martial capability, the way he looked standing in a room, golden and imposing, every inch the Lannister heir. He gave Jaime every tool for performing the role of great knight, and none of the support for developing the person underneath. Jaime understood this in the way children always understand what their parents actually value. He performed. He became extraordinarily good at it, and in performing it so completely, he gradually lost access to the parts of himself that existed outside it. When Aerys took Jaime for the Kingsguard, Tywin's fury was the fury of a man who had an asset removed, not a father whose child had been wronged. Jaime entered the Kingsguard already knowing his father's love was conditional on his usefulness. The White Cloak had removed that usefulness entirely. What followed was a decade of Jaime serving a king descending into madness, watching things he could not prevent, and accumulating knowledge of what Aerys was capable of. His reputation remained the polished surface of a man no one looked beneath. The wildfire was already beneath King's Landing when Jaime killed Aerys. Aerys had ordered it placed there months before, enough to burn the city to the waterline. Jaime knew. He had been told, as Kingsguard. He killed the pyromancer first, then Aerys. He was sitting on the Iron Throne, not from ambition, but from the exhaustion of a man who had just done something that would follow him forever. When Ned Stark arrived and drew his conclusions without asking questions, Tywin never provided the context. The Kingslayer reputation settled onto Jaime permanently because the one man who could have challenged it chose not to. Defending Jaime would have required a kind of public vulnerability Tywin's system did not permit, acknowledging that Jaime was a person rather than an asset. He could not do this. So Jaime remained the Kingslayer. The wound stayed open, and years later he told the truth to Tyrion, not to his father, who could have used it, but to his brother, who simply needed to know it. Tyrion's formation is, in one sense, the simplest to describe. It was the systematic application of rejection by the one person whose acceptance he needed most. Tyrion did not come into the world demanding little. He came into it with enormous capacity, intellectual, emotional, political, and a need for the acknowledgement that such capacity naturally seeks from its parents. He wanted to be seen, not celebrated, simply seen, recognized as a person who existed and had value. Tywin would not provide this. The rejection was decided at birth and never revisited. What makes this tragic rather than simply cruel is what Tyrion actually was. Strip away everything else and look at the mind underneath. Tyrion was, by almost any honest assessment, the most intellectually capable of Tywin's children, the child most like Tywin, in the ways Tywin cared about most. And Tywin could not see it, or would not. The distinction barely matters in terms of outcome. So Tyrion adapted. He developed wit as a defense, sharp and self-deprecating, making the mockery his own before others could weaponize it. He developed an appetite for books, for wine, for pleasure generally. Not because he was dissolute, but because pleasure was available in ways that approval was not. And underneath all of it, consistently, was a man who was trying to earn something, trying to find the performance that would finally produce the recognition that would make sense of everything. He served as acting hand during the most dangerous period of the War of Five Kings and held King's Landing together through Stannis' assault. When Tywin arrived and saved the city, Tyrion received no acknowledgement. His father visited his sick room to explain that Tyrion would receive no credit, no reward, and that the position of hand was no longer his. Most men would have stopped trying. Tyrion kept trying because the need for the thing he could not have was deeper than the evidence that it would never come. This is what made him so dangerous eventually. Not the wit or the political intelligence. A man with lesser intelligence and the same pain is simply a bitter man. A man with Tyrion's intelligence and that pain is something the world needs to take seriously. Tywin never took it seriously. He never looked at what he was creating in the space between Tyrion's need and his refusal to meet it. Step back, and the pattern is clear. Tywin produced children capable, in proportion to their damage, who had developed extraordinary abilities precisely because ordinary paths to security were closed. By the measures he would have recognized, this was success. They were formidable. They could navigate power and manage enemies. But all three were fundamentally turned against the family's long-term interests in ways the capability concealed. Cersei's ruthlessness without restraint would burn down his alliances. Jaime's wound would lead him away from the Lannister cause entirely. And Tyrion, brilliant and wounded, would eventually stop trying to earn approval and start calculating what to do with 30 years of accumulated anger. The system produced exactly what it was designed to produce. 3 people waiting for the moment they could stop performing. In 282 years after Aegon's conquest, the Seven Kingdoms moved toward war with the particular momentum that comes not from a single cause, but from the accumulated pressure of too many wrongs left unaddressed for too long. The murder of Rickard and Brandon Stark in the throne room, the demand for the heads of Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, Jon Arryn's refusal and his banners rising in the Vale. The North erupted in fury, the Stormlands declared for Robert, and the machinery of rebellion, once started, pulled in houses from across the realm with the irresistible gravity of a cause that had genuine justice on its side. Through all of it, Tywin Lannister sat at Casterly Rock and waited, This is the first thing to understand about his role in Robert's rebellion, because it is the thing most easily misread. His neutrality was not confusion or cowardice, or the paralysis of a man who could not decide which side served his interests. It was a deliberate, calculated strategy executed with the patience that defined everything he did. It was the patience of a man who understood that the most powerful position available in a conflict was not the first mover, but the last. The last mover committed when the outcome was already visible and the need for his support was absolute. Tywin had been watching the Targaryen dynasty deteriorate for years from his seat above the gold mines. He had been running the same calculation continuously, updating it as events developed. The calculation was not complicated, but it required the willingness to hold still while others moved. It required absorbing the political cost of apparent inaction while waiting for the moment when action would have maximum effect. What the calculation told him, consistently, was that committing early was dangerous in proportion to how early you committed. The rebels might win, might lose, or might fracture internally before the thing was decided. Tywin had seen enough of war to know that early momentum meant nothing without the logistical and political sustainability to convert it into final victory. Robert Baratheon was a gifted fighter and a charismatic leader, but charisma and fighting ability had ended on the wrong side of too many conflicts to be treated as guarantees. So he waited. And while he waited, he managed the situation at home. The Westerlands remained quiet during the early stages of the rebellion. Tywin's bannermen did not march. His army did not mobilize. He paid his taxes to the crown, since Aerys was still king technically, and the forms of loyalty required maintenance. He said very little publicly about the conflict consuming the rest of the realm. To those watching from outside, his position was ambiguous. To Tywin, it was entirely clear. He was not neutral, he was patient. He was also, during this period, watching the specific dynamics of the rebellion with the attention of a man who understood that the war's outcome would determine the shape of the next generation of Westerosi politics. Who survived, who rose, who owed what to whom. The answers to these questions would define where power sat after the fighting stopped. Tywin intended to sit inside those answers rather than outside them. The rebels had genuine strength. Jon Arryn was an experienced lord and a steady hand. Eddard Stark, newly Lord of Winterfell, after his father and brother's murders, brought northern fury that translated directly into military commitment. And Robert Baratheon was the kind of fighter who could shape a battlefield through personal example in ways that more cautious commanders could not. Tywin assessed all of this. He noted, without sentimentality, that the Targaryen cause was managing its own destruction with remarkable efficiency. Aerys was making decisions that converted potential supporters into enemies. He was alienating the lords who might otherwise have remained loyal out of habit or calculation. Meanwhile, the rebels were consolidating their alliance through the marriage of Eddard Stark to Catelyn Tully, binding the North and the Riverlands together through blood and shared stakes. The critical moment arrived when the Battle of the Trident resolved the war's central question. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the heir whose survival was the Targaryen cause's only remaining hope, faced Robert Baratheon in single combat at the river crossing. Robert's warhammer connected. Rhaegar died. The rubies scattered across the water. And the calculation Tywin had been running for months resolved itself into a single clear output. The Targaryens were finished, not weakened, not retreating, finished. Without Rhaegar, there was no restoration. Without restoration, loyalty to Aerys was not a political position. It was a suicide pact. The remaining Targaryen forces would disintegrate. The lords who had maintained neutrality or nominal loyalty would begin to recalculate. And Robert Baratheon, who had just killed the crown prince with his own hands in front of witnesses, would be the next king of the Seven Kingdoms. Tywin needed to be on the right side of that outcome. More specifically, he needed to be necessary to that outcome. He needed to arrive not as a beneficiary of someone else's victory, but as a contributor without whom the final chapter could not be written. This required timing. Too early, and he was simply another rebel lord. Too late, and the position was already filled. The window was specific, and Tywin understood its dimensions precisely. He called his banners. The Lannister army that assembled was enormous. The Westerlands, unified under 20 years of Tywin's absolute authority, could produce military force that few other regions could match. The host that marched east toward King's Landing was not a symbolic gesture. It was the most formidable, uncommitted military force remaining in the realm. Its arrival at the walls of the capital would determine whether the city fell cleanly or badly. Tywin sent a message ahead. He had come to defend the city. He was a loyal lord, answering the call of his king, bringing the strength of the Westerlands to protect the Targaryen seat. The gates opened. What followed was not a defense. It was a sack. The Lannister forces entered King's Landing and proceeded to demonstrate, for the second time in Tywin's life, that the distinction between ally and conqueror was a matter of timing rather than principle. His men moved through the city with the particular efficiency of soldiers who understood what was expected of them. Not the chaotic violence of an undisciplined army given license, but the directed, purposeful application of force that Tywin's forces had always practiced. In the throne room, Aerys was alive when the Lannister forces arrived, barely, and not for long. The king had ordered his pyromancer to light the wildfire beneath the city, rather than surrender it. He had watched the Lannister banners enter through the gates he had opened on the assumption of their loyalty. In his final spiral of paranoid fury, he had given the order that would have killed tens of thousands of people along with himself. Jaime had killed the pyromancer, and then, standing behind his king with his sword at his side, made the decision that would follow him forever. Aerys died at the base of the Iron Throne with his throat cut, his blood cooling on the stones, the wildfire unlit beneath the city. Tywin arrived in the throne room to find his son sitting on the Iron Throne, holding a sword still wet with the king's blood. Ned Stark arrived through the doors, with cold fury in his eyes and conclusions already formed. The confrontation that followed established the fault line of Robert's entire reign. Ned saw a sack, a betrayal, a murder. He saw the bodies of Elia Martell and her children, wrapped in Lannister cloaks as evidence of loyalty, and the fury had the quality of something that would not pass. Robert saw one war and a necessary ally, and chose not to look. The deaths of Elia and her children revealed the logic Tywin applied to political violence most completely. Rhaegar's children were Targaryen heirs, restoration rallying points as long as they lived. Tywin ordered their deaths. The logic, by his framework, was straightforward. What was not logically required was the manner. Gregor Clegane killed Elia's infant son by dashing his head against a wall, then raped and murdered Elia. The children's bodies were brought to Robert wrapped in crimson cloaks. This was not military necessity. Military necessity required that the children not survive. It said nothing about how they died or how the bodies were presented. The manner was a message about the nature of the new power behind the throne. It was Castamere logic applied without the restraint that even Castamere had possessed. Ned argued with Robert about it, with an intensity that strained their friendship. Robert dismissed it. The argument of convenience won over the argument of principle, as it tends to when the man making it has just won a war and wants to enjoy it. But Ned understood that the manner of the Lannisters' entry into the city told you everything about how they intended to operate once inside. He was right, and being right was not sufficient protection against people who were wrong in more effective ways. Robert Baratheon became king. Cersei became queen. The Lannister Golden Lion settled over King's Landing with the quiet permanence of something that has found exactly the position it was looking for. And Tywin returned to Casterly Rock. He had not been offered the hand's chain. Robert gave it to Jon Arryn, the man who had started the rebellion. Tywin accepted this without complaint because he understood something Robert perhaps did not articulate to himself. The hand's chain was a position. Positions could be held and lost. What Tywin had secured was structural integration. His daughter was queen, his bloodline would be royal, and the wealth of Casterly Rock was permanently fused with the Iron Throne. A hand could be replaced. A queen could not be unqueened without consequences Robert could not absorb. But there was the matter of Jaime. The Kingslayer had become, in the hours between Aerys's death and Robert's arrival, the defining image of the Sack's moral ambiguity. He sat on the throne, not claiming it, simply sitting in the exhaustion of a man who had just done something enormous. When Ned arrived, the image crystallized into a story the realm immediately began telling itself. The Oathbreaker on the throne, the Kingslayer. The story was not false. Jaime had killed Aerys, but it was facts without context. The context changed everything. The wildfire, Aerys's order to burn the city, a young man standing behind a mad king knowing tens of thousands of people would die if he did nothing. Ned did not ask for the context. Tywin never provided it. Whether the Kingslayer reputation served Tywin's purposes is a question worth sitting with. A Jaime, whose honor was intact, had options. He could build an independent position and was less anchored to the family. A Jaime, who was the Kingslayer, needed the Lannister name to define his standing. The shame kept him close. The shame kept him manageable. Whether Tywin calculated this or simply found the outcome acceptable, the effect was the same. What he did not fully account for was Dawn. The deaths of Elia Martell and her children were not absorbed into history as cleanly as he calculated. Oberyn Martell, Elia's brother, was a man of exceptional capability and implacable grievance. He was alive and aware of exactly who had given the order. Tywin noted this and filed it. He did not give it the weight it deserved. He went home. He had what he needed. The form it took was less important than the substance. The years between Robert's rebellion and the War of Five Kings are easy to misread as a fallow period. They were not. They were years of consolidation, of the particular kind of work that powerful men do when they are not visibly doing anything. They were years of ensuring that the position they had built did not erode in their absence from the center of things. Casterly Rock under Tywin was a model of administrative efficiency. Taxes collected, justice dispensed, disputes resolved before they could fester. The Westerlands prospered, and its lords served without visible resentment. Not out of love, but because they knew exactly what Tywin expected, and exactly what the consequences of failing to meet those expectations were. That clarity, however cold, created the stability that more emotionally variable lordship tends to undermine. From this base, Tywin watched. He watched Robert's reign unfold with the detachment of a man who had correctly predicted its essential character before it began. Robert was a magnificent fighter and a poor king. He was impatient where governance requires patience, present in the moment in a way that made him electrifying in person, and ineffective at the long, unglamorous work of managing a kingdom across decades. Jon Arryn compensated as hand, and for years this kept the realm functional. The specific question of whether Tywin knew about Cersei and Jaime during these years has a likely answer. He suspected. Probably more than suspected. The signs, for a man of his observational acuity and intimate knowledge of both his children's characters, would not have been difficult to read. Yet he did not investigate, did not confront, did not act. Checking this situation was not within his power in any clean sense. To investigate formally was to create knowledge that forced a response, and every available response destroyed something he needed to preserve. So he maintained deliberate blindness, not passive ignorance, but an active, disciplined choice to see what was useful and decline to look at what was not. The cost of that blindness was Joffrey. Not literally, since Joffrey existed regardless, but the system of not seeing extended to Joffrey's character, which Tywin was receiving through filtered reports and Cersei's uncritical adoration, rather than direct observation. The specific danger of what Joffrey actually was would not become clear until it was too late to correct. The Greyjoy rebellion of 289 years after Aegon's conquest pulled Tywin briefly back into active politics. He contributed the Westerlands levies with characteristic efficiency. The rebellion was crushed, and Theon Greyjoy went to Winterfell as ward. Tywin filed the detail away and returned home. In 298 years after Aegon's conquest, Jon Arryn died. Tywin updated his calculation immediately. The hand was gone, the power structure was reorganizing, and his position relative to the opening was unique. His daughter was queen, his grandchildren were heirs, and whatever happened in King's Landing next, the Lannisters were inside it in a way no other house could claim. Robert was destroying himself. The drinking, the hunting, the indifference to governance. Tywin had been watching this accumulate for years. Jon Arryn had been old. The crisis that the structural instabilities of Robert's reign made inevitable was approaching. Tywin began to prepare. He did not know yet that it would begin with his own family's choices. He was looking at the horizon, as always, not inward. And what was coming, as it turned out, was everything. Wars, when examined closely enough, rarely begin where history decides to start them. The War of Five Kings is usually dated from the moment Ned Stark's head left his shoulders on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor, or perhaps from the moment Catelyn Stark took Tyrion Lannister prisoner on the road to the Eyrie, or perhaps from Robb Stark calling his banners in the cold fury of a North that had just lost its lord. The precise starting point depends on where you stand and what you are looking for. From Tywin Lannister's position, the war had been approaching for years. He had watched the structural conditions accumulate, the weakening of Robert, the inadequacy of the succession, the specific dangers of Joffrey's character, and the unresolved tensions between the Lannisters and every house they had wronged or threatened or absorbed by force rather than genuine loyalty. The exact shape of the crisis was unknowable in advance. That some crisis was inevitable he had known, and he had prepared for it with the patient efficiency that defined his entire method of operating. When it came, he was ready. The opening moves of the war revealed immediately that Tywin understood something his enemies did not. The war's first phase was not about battles. It was about time and positioning and the destruction of the economic and agricultural base that sustained an enemy's ability to field armies across seasons. Battles were decisive moments, but decisive moments required the prior creation of conditions in which they could be decisive. Tywin created those conditions before his enemies had finished deciding what they were fighting for. He invaded the Riverlands. The logic was cold and clear. The Riverlands sat between the Lannister Westerlands and the Stark-controlled North. They were ruled by House Tully, whose daughter Catelyn had married Ned Stark, and whose son Edmure would eventually become their military commander. By moving into the Riverlands immediately and devastatingly, burning crops, taking castles, and destroying the region's capacity to function as a supply base, Tywin accomplished several things simultaneously. He punished the Tullys and drew Robb Stark south into ground Tywin had chosen. He demonstrated to every watching lord that the Lannister response to defiance was not proportionate or measured, but total. And he began degrading the enemy alliance's logistical capacity before it had fully consolidated. The Riverlands campaign was brutal in the specific way that Tywin's military operations were always brutal. Not chaotic, not driven by undisciplined soldiers doing what soldiers do when control fails, but purposeful. The burning was ordered, the destruction planned. It was Castamere logic applied to geography rather than a single house. The message written in ash across the fields of an entire region. Lords who had thought neutrality might be available to them discovered that Tywin's operations did not recognize neutral ground. You were either with the Lannisters, or you were in the path of the army. Most chose quickly. Then Robb Stark arrived, and the calculation changed. Robb was 17. This is worth remembering, not to diminish what he accomplished, since what he accomplished was genuinely extraordinary. But it establishes the context in which Tywin initially assessed him. A 17-year-old lord leading an army for the first time, fresh from Winterfell, with no battle experience, and commanders who were still learning to follow him, rather than simply accompanying him. The assessment Tywin initially made was not contemptuous exactly, but it was confident. He had fought and outmaneuvered lords with decades of experience. A boy with burning motivation and untested talent was a manageable problem. He was wrong. And the wrongness of his initial assessment is one of the more instructive moments in his entire career. It reveals the one systematic blind spot in Tywin's otherwise comprehensive understanding of military and political dynamics. He underestimated what genuine tactical instinct, operating without the weight of established patterns, could produce. Robb divided his forces, sending a portion toward Tywin's army as a feint, while leading his main host west. At the Battle of Whispering Wood, he caught Jaime Lannister's force in an ambush that Jaime, for all his considerable military gifts, did not see coming until it was already complete. Jaime was taken prisoner. The greatest knight in the realm, Tywin's heir, the Kingslayer himself, captured by a teenager operating on instinct and nerve. The news reached Tywin like a physical shock, not because he expressed it that way, since he never expressed anything that way, but because the implications were structural. Jaime, in enemy hands, was a hostage, a negotiating liability, a rallying point for Stark morale. More immediately, the Battle of the Camps that followed destroyed another Lannister army, relieved River Run, and established Robb Stark as a commander who could not be managed through conventional calculations about youth and inexperience. Tywin recalibrated immediately. The recalibration is one of the things that distinguished him from lesser commanders. It was the ability to absorb a genuine setback, update the assessment that had produced it, and adapt the strategy without the emotional resistance that pride tends to create in men who have been wrong. He had been wrong about Robb. He updated the assessment. Robb was a serious military threat who required a serious military response. He retreated from his forward position and began rebuilding. He drew on the Westerland's deep reserves of men and material, reorganized his forces, and sought the conditions under which his advantages, experience, resources, and political relationships could be brought to bear against Robb's singular advantage of unexpected tactical brilliance. This is where Tywin demonstrated something that raw military talent cannot replicate. It was the understanding that wars are not won or lost in individual battles, but in the sustained management of time, resources, and political alignment. Robb could win battles. Tywin intended to win the war by a different method. In King's Landing, Joffrey's decision to execute Ned Stark revealed the structural problem at the heart of everything Tywin had built. He had not ordered the execution. The managed outcome had been arranged. Ned confesses, goes to the wall, the political damage is contained. Joffrey changed his mind at the moment of maximum visibility and converted a managed crisis into a war that the Lannisters could have avoided. The weapon on the throne was not a weapon Tywin could reliably aim. He filed this and continued. There was a war to win. He sent Tyrion to King's Landing. This is one of the few moments where Tywin's actions toward Tyrion cannot be explained entirely by contempt. He appointed his youngest son as acting hand with real authority over the city's defenses and the entire administrative apparatus during the most dangerous period the Lannisters had faced. He did this because Tyrion was the most qualified person available. Cersei was too compromised. Jaime was a prisoner. Tyrion had the intelligence and political instincts the moment demanded. The appointment was purely functional, with no warmth and no acknowledgement. He told Tyrion he was being sent because Cersei could not control Joffrey, and someone had to. Tyrion went and handled it. He reorganized the defenses, managed the small council, navigated Joffrey's volatility, and prepared the city for Stannis' assault at a level that would have been remarkable from any hand. When Tywin arrived with the Tyrell forces and saved the city, Tyrion received no acknowledgement. Tywin visited his sick room to communicate that the position was finished, the authority was returning, and any reward Tyrion believed he had earned would not be forthcoming. But Robb Stark was still in the field, still winning battles, still commanding the loyalty of the North and the Riverlands, still representing the one military problem that Tywin had not yet solved. The Blackwater had secured the South. The North remained contested. Tywin's solution arrived in the form of the situation's own dynamics. Robb made mistakes. The marriage to Talisa, the execution of Rickard Karstark, cascading losses of support. Tywin watched an enemy's self-destruction with the attention of a man who understood it was the most efficient possible victory, requiring no expenditure of his own resources. He converted the opportunity into a structure. Walder Frey had been insulted by Robb's broken marriage oath. Roose Bolton, one of Robb's own commanders, had loyalty rooted in calculation rather than conviction, and calculation could be redirected. Tywin offered Bolton the wardenship of the North and Frey restored Lannister backing. In return, they would end Robb Stark. The mechanism was the most sacred institution in Westerosi culture. Guessed right, the law binding a host to protect those who had eaten his bread and salt was the context in which the trap was set. Robb came to the twins for Edmure Tully's wedding. He ate, drank, and accepted the hospitality. The musicians began to play The Rains of Castamere. That choice of signal requires a moment. The song that encoded everything Tywin Lannister did to those who defied him was the announcement, in the only language that mattered, of whose operation this was. Robb Stark died at the Red Wedding alongside his wife, his unborn child, his mother, and thousands of northern soldiers. The young wolf, who had outmaneuvered Tywin on multiple battlefields, was destroyed not through military superiority, but through the willingness to operate entirely outside the constraints that honor imposed on men like Robb. This was Tywin's victory. Complete, total, efficient. One night, one feast, one song. The analytical point is direct. Robb could not have done to Tywin what Tywin did to Robb. It required treating the most sacred social institution in the realm as an instrument, rather than a constraint. Robb was too much his father's son for that. And in a war against Tywin Lannister, being his father's son was not sufficient protection. The most powerful man in Westeros was now also the most completely victorious. The war was won. His family sat at the center of everything. He had never been more powerful. He had never been closer to the edge of everything unraveling. There is a difference between holding power and exercising it, and Tywin Lannister understood this distinction better than any man alive. The first time he had been hand, under Aerys, he had exercised it almost completely. He ran the realm while the king performed monarchy, building and administering and managing with a thoroughness that made the 2 decades of his tenure the most effectively governed period in recent Targaryen history. The power had been real, the authority genuine, the results measurable. The second time was different. The power and authority were still real, but the conditions in which it had to be exercised had changed in ways that Tywin's framework was not entirely equipped to manage. Those changes would accumulate across the months of his second tenure, with the quiet persistence of water finding its way through stone. He arrived at King's Landing in the aftermath of the Blackwater as the man who had saved the city. This was not a narrative he constructed. It was simply true, and its truth gave him an authority in the capital that no formal appointment could have provided as quickly. The small council, the lords who had survived the siege, the city itself, all of them understood that the Lannister army and the Tyrell alliance it had brought had been the difference between survival and Stannis' justice. Tywin did not need to remind anyone of this. He simply proceeded as the man who had earned the right to proceed. He took the hand's chain as though it had been waiting for him, which in every meaningful sense it had. Joffrey did not resist. He was, in the immediate aftermath of the battle's resolution, sufficiently in awe of his grandfather's arrival to be temporarily manageable. The small council reorganized itself around Tywin's presence with the smooth adaptation of men who recognized that the room's power dynamics had fundamentally changed. For a brief period, a matter of weeks, perhaps a month, the court functioned with something approaching efficiency. Then the complications reasserted themselves. The first and most persistent complication was Joffrey. Tywin had managed difficult principles before. He had managed Aerys for nearly 2 decades, navigating paranoia and cruelty through patient management of information and deference. Joffrey was a different problem. Not because he was more powerful than Aerys, but because Aerys' cruelty had internal logic that made it at least partially predictable. Joffrey's cruelty was impulsive, disconnected from consequence, driven by the immediate satisfaction of power without restraint. By the time Tywin was in the same room as Joffrey daily, the character was formed and the formation was catastrophic. His method was direct authority through presence and tone, correcting Joffrey's judgments with brevity and refusing to pretend they were sound. This kept the most publicly damaging expressions of Joffrey's character in check. but it could not govern the domains Tywin did not directly supervise. The Tyrell alliance required constant maintenance. This was expected, since alliances always do. But the specific demands of the Tyrell relationship were not the manageable friction of ordinary vassal maintenance. Olenna Tyrell and her granddaughter Margaery were not subordinates who had entered the Lannister orbit. They were partners who had made a strategic calculation about which alliance served them best, and they maintained, at all times, the clear awareness that they were partners rather than dependents. Olenna deserves particular attention. Her presence in King's Landing during these months represents one of the few genuine peer relationships that Tywin's second tenure produced. She was his equal in political intelligence, his superior in certain kinds of social manipulation, and entirely unintimidated by the authority that cowed everyone else in the capital. Their interactions had the quality of two grandmasters playing the same game at the same board, each fully aware of the other's capabilities, each managing the relationship with a care that acknowledged the genuine danger the other represented. Tywin respected Olenna in the specific way he respected capability wherever he found it, without warmth, without affection, but with the genuine acknowledgement that she was not to be underestimated. He managed her carefully, ensured that the Tyrell family received the visibility and the formal recognition that the alliance's terms implied, and navigated the specific tension between giving the Tyrells enough to keep them committed and giving them so much that their position began to rival rather than support Lannister dominance. This was a balance he could maintain. The Tyrells were ambitious but rational. They wanted position, influence, and the long-term security of their family's elevation, all of which Tywin could provide within limits without compromising his own authority. The balance required attention, but it was the kind of attention his framework was designed to give. What his framework was less designed for was the social and political texture of a court that was not simply his court. The Westerland's bannermen were his in the absolute sense. They obeyed because the alternative was Castamere. King's Landing was not the Westerlands, the lords who moved through its corridors, the council members who sat around its tables, the entire ecosystem of the capital's political life. None of them owed Tywin the unconditional deference that his home domain provided. They respected him, feared him in the general sense that his reputation demanded, and cooperated with him because cooperation was clearly in their interest. But they were not his. The distinction created friction of a kind he had not had to manage for decades. It was the friction of operating in an environment where his authority, though genuine, was not absolute. He moved immediately to consolidate through marriage. The Sansa Stark situation was, from Tywin's perspective, a straightforward political problem, with a straightforward political solution. Sansa was heir to Winterfell, or would be after Robb's death removed him from the succession, and Bran and Rickon were presumed dead, following Theon's apparent murder of them. Winterfell was the seat of the Warden of the North. Whoever held Sansa held a claim to that wardenship through her. The political logic of securing that claim for the Lannisters was as clear as political logic ever gets. The solution was Tyrion, not because Tywin had concluded that Tyrion deserved the elevation, since he had not. Tyrion was simply the available Lannister male who could be deployed for this purpose without complicating other arrangements. Tywin put Tyrion and Sansa together. With the same unsentimental efficiency he brought to every political deployment. When both parties objected, Tyrion on Sansa's behalf, and Sansa from within the particular helplessness of her position, he dismissed the objections as irrelevant variables. Sansa was not a person in this calculation. She was an asset. Her feelings about the marriage were not a factor the calculation recognized. Tyrion treated her with genuine consideration. He did not consummate the marriage, maintained a respectful distance, and tried within the constraints of the situation to be something other than her captor. Tywin observed this with the particular contempt he reserved for sentiment deployed in domains where sentiment was not useful. Kindness to Sansa did not advance the Lannister position. It simply created an uncomfortable domestic situation that the political objective did not require. What Tywin missed was that Sansa was observing everything. She was not the naive girl she appeared. She was learning in the specific school of watching Tywin operate up close. The same lessons Tywin had learned watching Tytos. The difference between power and its performance, between the forms of authority and its actual exercise. She was paying attention and filing things away. She was doing exactly what Tywin would have done in her position. He did not see this because she was a young girl, and young girls were assets rather than actors in his framework. This was a recurring blind spot. The inability to recognize capability in people his framework had categorized as pieces rather than players. Sansa was a piece. She was not a piece. The distance between those two assessments would eventually matter. The administrative achievements of Tywin's second tenure deserve acknowledgement alongside its failures, because the failures can obscure what was genuinely accomplished. The realm was in a disastrous state when he arrived. The war had devastated the riverlands, disrupted trade across multiple regions, emptied the crown's treasury, and created a governance vacuum that Robert's mismanagement had begun and the war had completed. Rebuilding required exactly the combination of administrative discipline and political authority that Tywin possessed in abundance. He settled the war's aftermath with efficiency. The Stark cause was destroyed. The Greyjoy rebellion on the western coast was being managed through Tywin's instructions to the appropriate lords, and the Tyrell alliance was providing the agricultural surplus that the capital needed to function. He reorganized the crown's finances with the attention of a man who found fiscal chaos genuinely offensive, not morally, but aesthetically, in the way that disorder offended a mind built for precision. He managed disputes between the lords who had fought on different sides of the war and now had to coexist within the same political structure. He converted enemies into something approaching functional subjects through the combination of incentive and implicit threat that he had always used most effectively. The realm worked in the specific way it worked when Tywin was at its center. Imperfectly, with friction, but with the basic competence that governance requires, and that was genuinely rare in Westeros outside his direct management. He was aware during all of this that the situation was less stable than its surface suggested. Joffrey remained ungovernable in the domains he could not directly supervise. Cersei was operating her own political agenda alongside and sometimes against his, cultivating relationships with Tommen, feeding information to Joffrey, and working to preserve her own influence in ways that frequently complicated Tywin's arrangements. The Tyrells were allies, but allies with their own objectives. Marjorie's management of Joffrey, the slow cultivation of a relationship that gave her leverage over the king, was a dynamic Tywin watched with careful attention. He recognized a parallel power structure being constructed within his own. And Tyrion, always Tyrion, the Shay situation continuing beneath the surface, Tyrion's defiance of the prohibition, a constant low-level friction in the relationship. The appointment to acting hand had created a dynamic where Tyrion had tasted genuine authority and would not easily pretend he had not. Tywin managed all of it. He was managing all of it, continuously, simultaneously, with the efficiency of a mind designed for exactly this kind of complexity. What he was not doing, what he had never done, in any context at any point in his life, was examining the accumulating pressure within the system he was managing. He could see the external stresses. He could not see what was building inside the people he was deploying. Tywin Lannister was at the apex of his power. He was also, without knowing it, sitting in the last period of stability his life would contain. Power, at its most complete, requires that the person holding it be able to predict the consequences of the decisions made in their name. This is the feature that distinguishes genuine authority from its performance. It is the ability to shape outcomes not just through direct action, but through the reliable operation of the structures and people you have put in place. Tywin Lannister had built his entire career on this principle. His reputation, his methodology, his entire approach to lordship was predicated on the understanding that if you controlled the environment carefully enough, the outcomes would follow. Joffrey was the environment he could not control. Not entirely, not consistently, and never in the specific moments when control mattered most. And in the period between the Blackwater and the Purple Wedding, the months when Tywin was at the formal peak of his power, this uncontrollable element at the center of everything he had built was quietly, persistently, undermining the structure from within. The daily reality of governing alongside Joffrey was a particular kind of professional torment that Tywin absorbed without visible complaint. Small council meetings were exercises in management as much as governance. There was the constant awareness that the king might at any moment insert himself into a discussion with a judgment so detached from reality that it required correction. And that correction, however carefully delivered, produced in Joffrey a sullen resentment that occasionally complicated the next week of governance. Tywin corrected him anyway. He had no other viable approach. Allowing Joffrey's decisions to stand when they were wrong would have been worse than the resentment that correction produced. Tywin was not constitutionally capable of allowing clearly wrong decisions to operate unchallenged simply to preserve the feelings of the person who had made them. He had never done this with anyone in any context. He was not going to begin with his grandson. The correction had its effects. Joffrey was not entirely without the capacity for learning. He absorbed certain kinds of information, developed certain kinds of political instinct, and understood in a limited way the relationship between power and its exercise that Tywin was modeling for him. But what he could not absorb was the discipline, the willingness to subordinate the immediate satisfaction of power to the longer-term requirements of its preservation. He could learn that certain actions had certain consequences. He could not internalize the lesson that this meant certain actions should not be taken. The cruelties continued, not always visible, not always public, but consistent. The treatment of servants, the private sadisms that filtered through the castle's social ecosystem in the way that the behavior of kings always filters through. They shaped the culture of the court in proportion to how clearly people understood that this was what the king was like, and that the king would continue to be like this indefinitely. Sansa Stark had borne the most visible share of this before her marriage to Tyrion. Joffrey maintained a specific targeting of her because she was available, because she represented the Starks, and because tormenting her was within his power and no one had stopped him. Tyrion's intervention had reduced, but not eliminated this. Joffrey found other targets, other expressions, other ways to fill the particular need that cruelty met in him. Tywin observed all of this with the assessment of a man cataloguing a liability. Joffrey was the most significant political liability he had ever managed. not because of what the boy had done yet, but because of the clear and obvious potential of what he might do, given sufficient opportunity and insufficient supervision. The marriage to Margaery was the primary management tool. Tywin had negotiated it as part of the Tyrell alliance, and it served multiple functions simultaneously. It bound the Tyrells to the crown through personal and dynastic connection. It gave Joffrey an object of attention that was not simply the exercise of cruelty, and it gave Tywin a secondary layer of management through Olenna, who was in the capital, watchful and capable, with aligned incentives to keep the situation manageable. For a time, the management worked. Margaery handled Joffrey with impressive skill, not through confrontation, which would have produced the opposite of the intended result, but through the careful cultivation of his better impulses. She used the flattery that acknowledged his power while gently redirecting its application. The social management of a woman who understood that her position required making a fundamentally unmanageable person feel managed without knowing he was being managed. Tywin watched Margaery's operation with the professional appreciation he extended to competent political maneuvering wherever he found it. She was good at this. She was also, as he fully understood, working toward Tyrell objectives that were not identical to Lannister objectives. She was building a position of influence over the king that operated independently of his own. This was a tension he managed through the balance of alliance maintenance. He gave the Tyrells enough that they remained committed, without giving them so much that the influence Margaery was accumulating over Joffrey became a rival power center rather than a complementary one. It was exhausting work, the kind of exhausting that does not show in a man who never shows exhaustion, but that operates beneath the surface as a continuous drain on the attention that could have been directed elsewhere. Cersei's deterioration was a separate and compounding problem. She operated a parallel political structure alongside his, with her own information networks, her own relationships, her own agenda. In the Westerlands, this had been manageable. In King's Landing, their spheres overlapped constantly. Her relationship with Joffrey was the primary mechanism. She had spent his entire life as his fiercest protector and most unreserved admirer. In adoring him, she consistently undermined Tywin's corrections with the message that Joffrey was magnificent, and anyone who suggested otherwise was wrong. Tywin could dominate the formal structures of governance and watch everything he accomplished there be quietly eroded in the private spaces where Cersei operated. The accumulating effect was a Joffrey who was afraid of his grandfather, but increasingly convinced by his mother that the fear was optional. The purple wedding arrived as the culmination of accumulated pressures. Tywin had managed every detail, the seating, the optics, the performance of Lannister stability. Joffrey destroyed it not by surviving it, but by dying at it, having first demonstrated the full range of behaviors that made governing alongside him such sustained damage limitation. He humiliated Tyrion publicly. He dismissed Tywin's corrections with a brazenness that exceeded his previous behavior. Then he choked on his wine and died in front of the assembled nobility of Westeros. While the court dissolved into chaos, Tywin was already working. He had Tyrion arrested, the obvious suspect with obvious motive, present at the moment with access to the wine. Whether Tywin believed Tyrion had done it is unknowable. What the record shows is that the arrest served his immediate interests regardless. It provided a suspect, channeled the court's grief and confusion into a productive direction, and converted Tyrion from a source of friction into a problem that could be managed through legitimate legal process. He moved simultaneously to consolidate around Tommen, gentle, biddable, receptive to guidance. Everything Joffrey was not. The Tom and Margaery marriage was arranged immediately to renew the Tyrell alliance before they could recalculate which side served them best. He was managing. Through the death of his grandson, the arrest of his son, the grief of his daughter, managing, adjusting, finding the path through chaos toward order. But Joffrey's death had revealed the fundamental fragility of everything he had built. The Lannister king had just died choking on wine at 13. Tommen was manageable but vulnerable. And Tywin, aging and confronting the time frame of his direct management for the first time, had built everything on himself. On his reputation, his presence, his specific combination of capability and ruthlessness that no one around him could replicate. He had built Tywin Lannister, and Tywin Lannister was mortal. The trial was supposed to be a solution. He was the most powerful man in Westeros. He was in complete control. He was also already finished. Justice performed rather than administered is a tool of power in a political culture where the powerful need legitimacy's clothing while remaining unwilling to accept genuine process. Westeros had seen such trials before. They were not uncommon. Tywin Lannister understood this distinction completely. He had operated within political structures his entire life with the full awareness that the gap between how things appeared and how they actually worked was not a flaw in the system, but one of its primary features. It was the feature that allowed power to present itself as something other than naked force, that gave the exercise of dominance the clothing of procedure and principle. The trial of Tyrion Lannister for the murder of King Joffrey was, from its construction to its conclusion, exactly this kind of performance. It was designed to produce a specific outcome. The specific outcome was Tyrion's conviction. Every element of the trial's architecture, the witnesses selected, the testimonies shaped, the atmosphere of the courtroom, the composition of the judges, was arranged in service of that conclusion before a single word of formal accusation had been spoken. Tywin sat as one of 3 judges. The other 2 were Mace Tyrell and Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dawn. Mace Tyrell's investment in the outcome was clear, given that his daughter had been present at Joffrey's death, and his family's alliance with the Lannisters required a visible demonstration of loyalty. Oberyn's inclusion was itself a political calculation, giving Dawn a voice in the proceedings so that Dawn's long-standing grievances about Elya's death would be temporarily absorbed into formal participation, that Oberyn would have his own calculations about what his presence in King's Landing meant was a variable Tywin had assessed and considered manageable. He was wrong about this, as he had been wrong about a limited number of things in his career. The wrongness would cost him the trial's intended conclusion and something considerably more significant than that. The witness architecture was constructed with the care that Tywin brought to all important arrangements. Each person called to speak was selected for the specific contribution they could make to a portrait of Tyrion that justified the verdict the judges were going to deliver. The testimony would not be fabricated, since fabrication was unnecessary and carried the risk of inconsistency under examination. It simply needed to be curated. The witnesses who had seen things that complicated the portrait of Tyrion as murderer would not be called. Those who had seen things that supported it would be given the opportunity to describe what they had seen in the most damaging possible framing. Lords and ladies of the court testified to statements Tyrion had made, looks he had given, and the quality of his relationship with Joffrey over the preceding months. Most of what they said was technically accurate. Tyrion had made statements that could be read as threatening. The relationship between him and the king had contained visible hostility, and Tyrion's response to the public humiliation Joffrey had performed at the wedding feast had been observed by enough people that its content was not in question. What the curated testimony constructed was a coherent narrative of motive, opportunity, and disposition. It was the portrait of a man who had reason to want the king dead, who had been present at the moment of death, and whose character, as presented by a sequence of credible witnesses, was consistent with the act he was accused of committing. Tyrion sat through all of it with the particular composure of a man who had spent his entire life being tried for things he was not guilty of. He had developed, through decades of practice, a functional relationship with the experience of public accusation. He did not collapse or rage. He watched the portrait being assembled and understood with the clarity of his considerable intelligence that it was being assembled by his father. This understanding that the architect of the performance arrayed against him was the man who had always refused to see him was not a revelation. It was a confirmation. It was the final, most complete expression of a dynamic that had been building for 30 years. It was the moment when Tywin's treatment of Tyrion stopped being ambient and became explicit and structural, when the contempt became not merely a quality of their relationship, but the mechanism of his son's destruction. Tyrion absorbed this. He was still absorbing it, still managing it, still functioning within it with the endurance that had always been, perhaps, his most underappreciated quality. The endurance of a man who had learned to continue in circumstances that would have broken people with easier lives. And then Shay walked into the courtroom. She had been brought to King's Landing. This was Tywin's arrangement. What calculation Shay made between loyalty to Tyrion and the other options available to her is not preserved in the record. What is preserved is what she said. She testified against Tyrion. The testimony was devastating in the specific way that only testimony from someone intimate with the accused can be devastating. Not through grand revelations, but through the accumulation of small, private details deployed in the most damaging framing. Private moments, words spoken in confidence, the texture of Tyrion's character as observed from close proximity, all of it presented in a version that stripped away context. She called him guilty. She described hatred where there had been complicated grief and need. It was a performance built on partial truths, which made it harder to refute than fabrication. Tyrion said nothing while she testified. He looked at her. What he felt is not accessible to the record, but the nature of it can be inferred from what he did in the hours after his escape, from the door he opened and the thing he found behind it. What he felt was the death of the last thing outside the Lannister family structure that had felt like his own. Shay had been the one domain he had claimed and held despite his father's prohibition. And she was here, in his father's courtroom, saying the words his father had arranged for her to say. Shay was not a person to Tywin. She was a tool. Tyrion's feelings about the tool were not a variable in the calculation. When Shay stepped down, the trial's intended conclusion was visible to everyone in the room. The witnesses had done their work. The portrait was complete, and the verdict was waiting to be delivered. All that remained was the formal process of pronouncing it. Tyrion was supposed to absorb this. That was the implicit expectation written into the trial's architecture. He would sit through the performance, understand its conclusions, and accept the managed outcome his father had arranged as the alternative to something worse. The Night's Watch waited. The confession, the conviction, the exile to the wall. This was the intended resolution. Ignoble, yes. The end of any pretense of Tyrion's position within the family, yes. but survival. Tyrion did not absorb it. Something that had been breaking for 30 years broke completely. The last filament of endurance snapped under the weight of Shay's testimony. He looked at the courtroom his father had built, the witnesses arranged, the judges his father sat among, and he was done. He stood up. He said he was guilty, not of killing Joffrey, but of being Tyrion Lannister, of being born a dwarf, of surviving when his mother had died in the process. He said he had not killed Joffrey, but that he wished he had. He told the assembled nobility that he was on trial for being a dwarf, that he had been on trial for it his entire life, and that he had no apologies to make. He demanded trial by combat. The courtroom erupted. The Night's Watch solution was gone, and with it, the controlled conviction. In their place was genuine uncertainty, an outcome that no political architecture could predetermine. Oberyn Martell stepped forward, not for Tyrion's innocence, since he had no investment in that question. His reason was that Tyrion's champion would fight the Mountain, the man who had murdered Elia, and that this fight was the opening he had been waiting for since he arrived in King's Landing. Tywin looked at the configuration. His least favorite son, championed by the one man with the specific grievance to make the outcome uncertain, and understood he had lost control of the proceeding. Oberyn was the better fighter, and he was winning. He was cutting the Mountain down, driving him to the ground, moving with the precision of a man who had been training for this moment for years. Then he made the mistake that the need for confession produces. He wanted the Mountain to say what he had done and who had ordered it. He circled the downed giant, demanding acknowledgement rather than finishing the fight. The Mountain grabbed him, pulled him down, crushed his skull. Tyrion was convicted. The managed outcome was restored at the cost of Oberyn's life, with the particular irony that the variable Tywin had least calculated had come closest to overturning everything. Tywin ordered the execution. It was scheduled. He had won. The trial he had constructed so carefully had produced the intended verdict. What he did not know was that Jaime and Varys were already moving through the castle toward Tyrion's cell. The trial, won so completely, had broken the last constraint that kept Tyrion within the system. He had won the trial. He had lost his son 30 years ago. The trial had simply finished demonstrating it in the most complete and public way available, and Tyrion had finally accepted the demonstration. Tywin sat in his chambers unaware that Jaime was below and Tyrion was already moving. The thing that was coming for him was not an enemy. It was a consequence. He just could not see the difference yet. Jaime went to Tyrion's cell the night before the execution and opened the door. What passed between them is one of the more consequential conversations in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. Not because of what was said about the trial, but because of what Jaime told his brother about Tysha. Tisha was the girl Tyrion had married when he was very young. A crofter's daughter, no standing, no political utility, and Tyrion had loved her with the complete, uncomplicated openness that young men who have never been loved bring to their first experience of it. The marriage had felt real. The feeling had been real. For a brief period, he had been happy. Then Tywin had ended it. The story Tyrion had carried for 20 years was that Tysha had been a whore. That Jaime had admitted this, that the whole thing had been staged, that he had been fool enough to believe a manufactured feeling was real. This story had done something specific and lasting to how Tyrion understood his own capacity to be loved. In the cell, Jaime told him the truth. Tisha had not been a whore. She had been what she appeared to be, a real girl, a real marriage, a real feeling. Jaime had lied on their father's instruction. Tywin had then ordered something considerably worse. His guards took Tysha, one by one, while Tyrion was forced to watch. Each paid a coin because that was what she was worth. Tyrion was made to participate last, paid in gold because he was a Lannister, and Lannisters paid more. 20 years of believing the wrong thing. 20 years of armor built on a lie his father had constructed and his brother had delivered. Jaime told him the truth in a cell, the night before Tyrion was supposed to die, and the 20 years of wrong understanding collapsed. Varys was waiting outside. The route had been arranged. Jaime had told him which way to go. Tyrion did not go that way. He went up, through the Tower of the Hand, where his father lived and slept, toward the thing he was not going to be able to leave without addressing. The rational decision was to take the escape and go. Tyrion did not make the rational decision. 30 years of grief and rage and need, and the specific revelation that Tysha had been real, had compressed into a single impulse. It was the need to face the man who had made him into what he was before the chance was gone. This was not rational. It was also entirely inevitable. He found his father's chambers. He entered them. And in the bed, he found the thing that Jaime's revelation had made into something different from what it had been before. Shae was in Tywin's bed, wearing Tyrion's mother's chains. Tyrion killed her. It was an act of rage and grief, and the violence of a wound opened and immediately pressed upon. It was the discovery that the last private thing he had possessed had been his father's instrument from the beginning. Not just, not calculated, but what 30 years of his father's damage produced when the last containment failed. He took the crossbow from the wall. Tywin Lannister was in the privy. This detail, which history has found variously darkly comic and appropriately symbolic, deserves a moment rather than a rush past. The most powerful man in the Seven Kingdoms, the Lord who had spent his entire life constructing an image of absolute authority and controlled dominance, the man who had made himself into a figure before whom the realm trembled. He was in the most undignified location a man can occupy when his son walked in with a crossbow. Tyrion aimed the weapon at his father and told him he was going to die. What followed was a conversation, brief, cold, and in no way different in its essential texture from every conversation these two men had ever had. Tywin's authority was present even here, even in this situation, even with a crossbow pointed at him. He spoke to Tyrion the way he had always spoken to Tyrion, from above, with the particular dismissiveness of a man who had decided long ago that the person in front of him was not worth the full weight of his attention. He called Shae a whore. Tyrion told him not to use that word. Tywin used it again. He said he would not be spoken to this way, that Tyrion would put down the weapon. Everything he had always said, in the specific tone he had always used. The tone that communicated that whatever was happening was not as serious as the person experiencing it believed it to be. That Tywin's authority was large enough to contain it, that the situation would resolve itself according to Tywin's preferences, because situations always resolve themselves according to Tywin's preferences. The shot took him in the gut. He said something. The word that came out of him, the last word Tywin Lannister spoke in his life, was the same word he had been using. The same contempt, delivered in the same tone, right up to the final moment. He had never modified himself for Tyrion, and was not going to modify himself now. He was Tywin Lannister, and Tywin Lannister did not yield. The second shot killed him. He died on the privy, with a crossbow bolt in him, shot by the son he had spent 30 years refusing to see. The man who had flooded the mines at Castamere, who had engineered the Red Wedding, who had ruled the most powerful domain in Westeros with absolute authority for 5 decades. He died in the dark, in the most undignified location available. His last word was a term of contempt for the woman whose presence in his bed had been the final revelation of what he was. Tyrion looked at what he had done. There was no triumph in it. There was something closer to the strange emptiness that arrives when an enormous thing has finally happened, and the anticipation of it is suddenly gone. He had not planned this. He had come because he could not leave without coming, and the coming had produced this. He left, found Varys, was loaded onto a ship as dawn broke over the city. The ship would take him across the narrow sea, away from the Lannister name and everything it had meant for the first 30-some years of his life. He was, for the first time, free. It did not feel like freedom yet. It rarely does, immediately. When the morning came and the discovery was made, the realm absorbed the news with the shock that comes when the apparently permanent proves otherwise. Tywin Lannister had seemed like the kind of man who would not simply die. Too large, too present, too completely the organizing principle of the world around him. The crossbow bolt was not metaphorical. He was simply gone, and the space he left behind was enormous. Kevan Lannister did what he could. He was capable and steady, and entirely without the specific quality that had made Tywin himself. That quality was the combination of intelligence and will and reputation that had allowed one man to be the load-bearing wall of an entire political structure. Kevan could manage. He could not replace. No one could replace. That was the point. Tywin Lannister died as he had lived, without modification and without concession. He used the contemptuous word that was available to him with the same automatic authority that had governed every interaction of his adult life. He did not apologize or explain himself, and he did not, in the final moments, see Tyrion differently than he had seen him in every moment before them. This is perhaps the most complete expression of who he was. In the extremity of the situation, stripped of all the political machinery and the administrative distance and the formal structures through which he normally operated, he was exactly what he had always been. Nothing had softened. Nothing had shifted. The man who faced Tyrion across that privy in the dark was the same man who had looked at a newborn infant 30 years earlier and decided, before the baby had done a single thing to deserve it, that he was not worth loving. He had decided something once, completely, and he had never revisited it. He had applied this principle to everything in his life. It had served him in almost everything in his life. And in this one case, in the case of the one person his decision most completely destroyed, it had cost him everything. He did not see this. He could not see it. Seeing it would have required looking inward in a way that Tywin Lannister had never once looked inward in his life. He was always looking forward. He was always looking at the horizon. And the thing that killed him came from inside the walls he had built so carefully, from the room he slept in, from his own family, from the sun he had refused to look at. He never looked down. The body was laid in state in the great sept of Baelor. The lords of Westeros came to pay their respects in the particular silence that powerful men's deaths produce. Not grief, exactly, but recalibration. It was the sound of people adjusting to the sudden absence of a gravitational field. The smell was already there by the second day. Tywin Lannister, who had controlled every detail of his presentation to the world for 50 years, lay decomposing faster than expected. Cersei noted it and said nothing. Jaime stood vigil and said nothing at all. Tyrion was already on a ship on the narrow sea. The funeral was magnificent. The forms were observed. Then the lords went home, and the real accounting began. The immediate aftermath was swift. Cersei became the effective power behind Tommen, and the specific qualities that Tywin's presence had suppressed began expressing themselves immediately. The patience, the strategic discipline, the willingness to accept short-term costs for long-term gain. Gone. She arrested the Tyrells, armed the Faith militant, and made enemies serially and without the compensating political architecture that converts enmity into manageable opposition. Within months, the most consequential alliance Tywin had built was collapsing. The Tyrells would eventually align with Daenerys Targaryen, contributing their resources to bring down the very throne Tywin had secured for his family. Tywin Lannister tried to stabilize the situation and was murdered by Varys before he could complete it. The two people most capable of preserving what Tywin had built were gone within months of his death. What remained was Cersei, reproducing the forms of Tywin's authority without any of the substance that had made those forms effective. To understand what Tywin actually built, you have to separate the personal legacy from the political one, because they moved in entirely different directions. The political achievement was real. Over 5 decades, he transformed House Lannister from a dynasty whose name had become a quiet joke into the most feared and powerful family in Westeros. He unified the Westerlands absolutely and administered 2 decades of effective governance as hand, the most functional period of Targaryen rule in living memory. He secured the Baratheon alliance through Cersei's marriage and won the War of 5 Kings through a combination of military competence and political architecture that constituted one of the most complete strategic victories in Westerosi history. These were genuine achievements. The realm functioned when he governed it. The eventual collapse is not evidence that he built nothing. It is evidence of a specific structural flaw. The reigns of Castamere outlived him. The song continued to communicate what it had always communicated about what it meant to defy the lion. It was his most durable achievement, but the personal legacy was the inverse of the political one. And the personal legacy is where the structural flaw that destroyed everything lived. Tywin built his entire achievement on a foundation that required him, specifically, personally him, to function. He built nothing that could operate without him. No institutions, no self-sustaining systems, no successors equipped and motivated to carry his work forward. Cersei had his ruthlessness and none of his discipline. Jaime had chosen, in the end, to walk away entirely, and Tyrion, the child most like Tywin in the capabilities that actually mattered, was across the narrow sea advising Daenerys Targaryen, using the intelligence his father never acknowledged against the very position his father had built. The children his system produced were pointing in every direction except the one that would have preserved it. This was not bad luck, it was consequence. There is a financial detail that illuminates everything. The gold mines of Casterly Rock had run dry years before his death, quietly depleting the very source of Lannister wealth, the foundation of the name, the reputation, the political architecture. The Lannisters did not have the gold the realm believed they had. Tywin managed the knowledge of this with the same discipline he brought to all sensitive information, sustaining the impression of inexhaustible wealth through the projection of an image the wealth had originally built. A Lannister always pays his debts. The saying continued to function as long as people believed it, and they believed it because his reputation gave them no reason to doubt it. But the gold was gone. The foundation was hollow. Image management is not solvency. The reigns of Castamere acquired new resonance after his death. Not just dominance, but excess, the violation of sacred law, ruthlessness that had won the war but poisoned everything after. The realm Tywin had won through total means was not a realm that trusted its victors. It had been waiting for the force to weaken. When it weakened, the waiting resolved quickly. The image had been maintained by the man who constructed it. Without him, it had no maintenance. What remains is the central paradox. He understood power better than almost anyone in Westerosi history. He spent his entire adult life studying it, practicing it, and refining his understanding through experience and the cold analysis that failure in capable men produces. He was one of the most formidable political minds the realm ever produced, and yet he failed to understand the most fundamental thing about it. Power that rests entirely on fear is power with no roots. It stands as long as the fear stands. Tywin was the fear, not the name, not the gold, not the song. Specifically, personally, irreplaceably, Tywin. Remove him and the fear had no anchor. It persisted briefly on inertia, then collapsed. He had built an empire without building the conditions for it to outlast him. He had built it without understanding that empires outlast their founders only when the people carrying them forward have been given reason to want to. Love, in other words. The thing he had decided, watching Titus fail, was the mechanism of weakness. Love was not weakness. Love was the load-bearing wall he never built, and without it, when he died, the ceiling came down. Tywin Lannister told the realm that a Lannister always pays his debts. He believed this completely. He paid every debt owed to him, gold when gold was owed, blood when blood was owed, fear when fear was the currency. What he never calculated was the debt he owed. He owed a debt to Joanna, whose death he converted into rejection rather than grief. He owed a debt to Cersei, whom he raised to be a weapon with no alternative. He owed a debt to Jaime, whose honor he allowed to be destroyed by his silence. And he owed a debt to Tyrion, who spent 30 years trying to earn the one thing his father had decided before Tyrion could speak or walk or demonstrate a single quality to permanently withhold. He owed these debts. They accumulated the way unpaid debts always do, with interest, gaining weight, becoming something the creditor is no longer equipped to manage. Tyrion managed it for him, with a crossbow, on a privy, in the dark. The boy who had watched his father be laughed at spent his entire life ensuring no one laughed at the Lannister name. He succeeded. They did not laugh at Tywin Lannister. They feared him and sang about him the way people sing about forces of nature, not with affection, but with the awed acknowledgement that something exists in the world larger than ordinary human scale. And then he died as he had lived, unable to say the one word to the one person that might have changed everything. He never said it. He said the other word instead. And the debt came due. Casterly Rock still stands above the sunset sea, its grey walls catching the western light the way they have caught it for thousands of years. The gold beneath it is gone. The mine's empty, the tunnels running dark and silent through the rock that was once the foundation of the most powerful name in Westeros. Somewhere in those tunnels, if you listened, you might expect to hear something. The echo of the name, the faint residue of everything that was built above the gold and collapsed when the gold ran out. But there is nothing. Only stone, only silence, only the particular quiet of a place that once meant something and now simply exists. It endures the way that stone always endures, long after the people who gave it meaning are gone. A Lannister always pays his debts. The debt is paid. The lion is gone.